Welcome to the Gnostic Informant. I'm Jesus, the Logos incarnate, and you are about to attain true Gnosis.
Welcome back to the Gnostic Informant, and you are about to attain true Gnosis. And I'm with Dr. Graham Oppy, one of the, I think, in my opinion, one of the leading philosophers of the time right now. And I'm really, really thrilled to have you on here. Thanks for coming on.
It's a pleasure.
So let's get right into it. Why not waste any time? Recently, there was a debate between Bart Ehrman and Mike Licona. And this is like a last minute question that I thought about for you, because they were discussing miracles quite a bit. They were sort of honing in on that area, and I wanted to. Bart Ehrman was arguing that they just don't happen. Like we're just not going to bend physics to say that miracles happen. That's just not a thing that happens. I was wondering, as a philosopher, who's very well read in this subject, what is your thoughts on this?
Well, I suppose you want to start off by saying exactly what the topic is, exactly what we mean by miracles, because of course lots of things happen that we don't know the explanations for.
Sure.
But if we define miracle to be somehow or other a special intervention of God in the natural order, then because I'm a naturalist and I don't think that there's a God, I don't think that there are any miracles. That's just going to fall out of other beliefs that I've got. But the kind of interesting questions that come up in connection with miracles are not so much the metaphysical questions, because that kind of gets resolved by your other metaphysical commitments, but the epistemological questions about how we go about assessing miracle claims, whether there are miracle claims that actually had sort of fairly strong credentials and so on. Those would be the epistemic questions would be more interesting to discuss, I think. And that's, in philosophy, that's, at least since the time of Hume, that's where the emphasis has been. So Hume argued that we could never have good reason to accept a miracle report. He argued that on two grounds. He argued it sort of a priori, that just from the very idea of a miracle, we could work out that it was just sort of impossible that we could have sufficient support. But he also argued on a posteriori grounds that when you actually look at miracle reports, they're always quite weak. There's a whole lot of things that sort of count against them. One of the main things being the way that, if we think about the kind of miracles that get adduced in support of religion, the miracles of any one faith tend to kind of undermine the miracles of all the others.
Right.
So maybe that's enough by way of a quick statement.
Yeah, that's a good answer. I mean, do you think that just the word miracle is sort of like an abstract idea that we just sort of made up? Like, it's not. Is it really? I mean, is that really? Is there really miracles in the sense that? Is it just something that we see that looks like we can't explain it, but there's probably an explanation for it?
Right. So that was why I drew the distinction about different things that you might mean by miracle, because in ordinary speech, we say that someone in a sporting event performs a miracle, where we just mean they did something that was pretty unlikely, that required a certain amount of skill and luck to come together in order for them to do it. And of course, that happens all the time. There are miraculous goals and miraculous comebacks and so on. But that's not a relevant use of the word miracle in this context. There are lots of coincidences. I mean, it's inevitable there'll be lots of coincidences, and some of those coincidences to the people involved may seem in a slightly different sense to be miraculous, right? That required great good fortune on their part. So somebody who wins a very large lottery might think of that as miraculous in this kind of sense, even though from a different perspective, so long as it was a fairly conducted lottery, it was inevitable that somebody would win it. Right? But in the context of philosophy of religion, miracle has a much more particular meaning that has to do with the actions of divine agents. I mean, the notion of a miracle isn't restricted to the Abrahamic religions, but we can kind of stick with that. Then we can just talk about special interventions on the part of God in the natural order, and the kind of big miracles of Christianity are things like the resurrection.
Right. And I always wonder. I was someone who was a believer who no longer is, and one of the things that I used to ponder as I was, deconverting, or as you will, is that in the text there's all these miracles happening left and right, and it's not even just Jesus. It's people like Peter and Paul, and they're healing the dead too. Like, Jesus is the only person who heals the dead in the Bible. But the question, the thing that I used to ponder is, if these people are just doing this all the time, why isn't it happening anymore? It's like, what are they? You know what I'm saying? I think of that, like, if these are things that are so easily done and possible, then why don't we see them anymore? How come they just don't happen anymore in the age of computers and internet and cameras?
Okay, so here's something, right? I mean, this is not it still happens, but still people still claim that it happens. So one year I did a radio interview just before Easter, a kind of atheist view on Easter. And after Easter, this guy rang me up and he said, I've been doing this for quite a while. I heal people by touch. And he spoke to me for about half an hour, telling me about all the people that the kinds of things that he could heal, illnesses, broken limbs, all kinds of stuff. The point about this story, I mean, there's other things I could say about it, but the point here is that there are certainly people still forming the belief that they have those kinds of abilities.
Yeah. There are a couple super chats. I want to get to those, but I just wanted to ask you about deism and atheism for a second. Like, for example, like, do you think that now in this sort of post Enlightenment world that there's sort of a tendency on people who are theists to use deism arguments, as in like God of the gaps, and he was there before space and time, and he set everything in motion, and then say, so therefore theism is true, and therefore my Quran is true, or therefore the Vedas is true. And what do you think about that?
Okay, so we'll wind back a bit. I'll say something about deism, because I mean, like all the words in this area, it's kind of contested, I guess, exactly what it means. But historically, the first deist is Herbert of Sherbury back in the 1620s or thereabouts, I guess. And for a couple of hundred years, at least after that, deism is a very popular view amongst, I don't know, what will I call them, the intellectual classes in Europe and in the US too. Like Thomas Paine is a very well-known deist. And Paine's a good example. In the Age of Reason, he gives lots of arguments for the existence of God. He uses cosmological arguments, teleological arguments. He's got a whole range of arguments. What he's against is organized religion, and that was true of all of the Deists. And the kind of historical context here is the Reformation, the Counter-Reformation, and the wars of religion. And lots of educated people drew the conclusion that not that there was no God, but that the church was completely malign, or the church is. It wasn't. They weren't picking in particular on the Catholic Church. It was all the Christian churches, and they had a more general view that the same was true about organized religion in general. So historically, Deists used exactly the same arguments that Theists used for the existence of God, and they believed a lot of the same things that Theists did. So they believed not just in God, but in providence, in an afterlife, and in many cases that what you did in this life determined whether you went to heaven or to hell. What they rejected was anything to do with priests, churches, and stuff like that. They thought all of that was something you should have nothing to do with. Okay, so that's now against that background, then your question's a bit odd, because it's not like there are different arguments. The Theists and the Deists just use the same arguments. Whether people these days just use God of the gaps arguments, there's some of that. There always has been, but there are plenty of arguments for that you'll get from people who believe in God that aren't really based on science at all. So for a start, there's kind of things like moral arguments. There's a priori arguments like the ontological arguments, and there are cosmological arguments that really don't draw on science. I mean, some of them do. So if you think about that kind of extended discussion about the Kalam argument, then that eventually gets into stuff about scientific cosmology, but it doesn't have to, because there are other arguments that are purely a priori about the impossible, the alleged impossibility of actual infinities and so on. So I think while it's true that some of the arguments that some people make for the existence of God, whether from a theistic or a deistic perspective, are kind of God in the gaps arguments, there are lots of arguments that those people make that are not.
What would you say as a rebuttal to the ontological argument? I'm sure you probably said this a million times, but let's hear it. Let's hear your current right now. What would you say against that, or is it a good argument? What do you think about it?
So there are many different ontological arguments. I mean, if I made one contribution to the discussion of ontological arguments in my book on the topic, it was to point out just how diverse the various kinds of ontological arguments are, and there are different things to say in response to different arguments. What I said at the end of my book, and I think that this is still kind of right, pick any of the ontological arguments, and one of the following things will be true. Either it'll be invalid, so the conclusion just won't follow from the premises, or it'll be quite clear that people who don't already believe in God reject at least one of the premises of the argument, or it will be that actually the conclusion of the argument is something that actually isn't in contention between theists and their opponents, like there are ontological arguments that establish that there's a reality, for example. And that sort of argument is not something that people who aren't theists have to object to. On the contrary, everybody should just accept that it's true. So then it's all a question of details. We look at a particular ontological argument and we see which of the categories it fits into.
Sure. And the last thing I want to ask you, when we get the super chats, why not deism? Why can't there be you think deism is not falsifiable, or do you think there's good reasons not to say that's not true?
Well, I think I'm going to say, given what I said before
Right.
about really the ways in which theists and deists typically differ about religion, not about God, I'm going to say that I've got the same reasons for rejecting the God of deism as the God of theism, because they're the same God, more or less. I mean, it depends, right? If you insist that it's sort of built into the notion of God, that God's triune, and that, so that you're buying into the doctrine of the Trinity and things like that, well, then deists are going to draw the line. They're not going to accept that.
What about?
I think so. But to answer your question directly, so this is a kind of theme in lots of the stuff that I've published in the last few years. I think that if you take a theistic or deistic worldview and you elaborate it in detail and you set it against a naturalistic worldview, like the one that I adopt, that's also set out in detail, and you compare them, it will turn out that the naturalistic view is more virtuous than the theistic or deistic view. At any rate, that will be my judgment. I mean, I allow that maybe you could have rational disagreement about this, and so I'm not saying that what I've just said is going to persuade everybody that they should be naturalists, but that's how I see it. I think that the best total view that you can come up with is one that doesn't include anything beyond, at least as far as the kind of causal reality goes, it's just natural reality. So there are no gods.
And I tend to agree with that. And I think that, but what about this though? What if there is like, not like a God with a personality like humans, but like some sort of mind that started this universe and then is gone. It is now has nothing to do with it. It's not even contributing or doing anything or manipulating anything. It was just, we're on our own now. Is that a possibility, or do you think that's kind of crazy?
So neither of those things, right? So it's given the way that I think about necessity and possibility, I don't think that it's a possibility, right? It's not a metaphysical possibility. I don't think that you would have to be irrational to accept a view of that kind, and I expect that there are people out there who have had exactly, or do have exactly that view. From my point of view, it's kind of a superfluous add-on to suppose that there is such a mind. What's quite satisfactory is just to think what there is natural reality, and it's got an initial point. The initial point's necessary. We don't need anything in addition to explain where natural reality came from. So that's the position that I favour.
Yeah, I think it's a good position. I just wanted to poke and prod a little bit, because it's not that often I get to talk to Graham Oppy, so But we got a super chat from Gaius Julius Windex. Thank you for the super chat. He says, "Why did Aristotle disagree with Plato?"
Short answer, because they're both philosophers, and philosophers disagree with each other about everything. So I mean, there are lots and lots of different points on which it seems that Aristotle and Plato are in disagreement. There are points on which they're in agreement. I'm to take one famous point. Aristotle didn't like Plato's theory of forms. He didn't like the idea of there being this third sort of independent realm where the Platonic entities hung out. He much preferred the idea that the properties of things were immanent within them, right? And Plato and Aristotle represent in their traditions that go on arguing with each other into the present.
Yeah. Thank you for that. The next one is kind of redundant of what we were just talking about, but they paid for it, so I got thank you for the super chat, Minnie. And he asked, "What do you think about Baruch Spinoza Deism?" Well, I guess it's kind of different.
So there's an argument about how to interpret Spinoza's philosophy. I mean, not everybody says that he was a deist. Some people say that he was a pantheist. Some people say that he was just a straight out naturalist.
Right.
And it's quite hard to interpret people like Spinoza and Hume who had kind of radical views and clearly didn't agree with orthodox religious positions of their time. They had to be guarded about what they said because there were serious risks involved in coming out as an atheist, for example. So
Right.
I think it's very hard to say. I think it's harder to say in Spinoza's case than it is in Hume's case exactly what Spinoza thought.
You almost get the sense that he isn't even he might be an atheist, like you said. He might just be.
He might be. I mean, he was called an atheist by lots of his contemporaries and people who came after him, and it's hard to tell. He could have been straightforwardly a deist. I think that it's more plausible in the case of Hume that he actually was an atheist, and the stuff that leads people to think that he was a deist was just sort of smokescreen that he put up to protect himself. But that's controversial as an interpretation.
Yeah. The next one is, thank you for that super chat. The next one is Melody Joy at the 99-cent super sticker. Thank you, Melody. It's always good to see you. I appreciate that very much. And I think there's another one coming up. Myth Vision Podcast, Derek Lambert. What does Dr. Oppy think of Bernardo Kastrup's philosophical position? He had a debate discussion with him. He is an idealist, I believe.
Okay, so Kastrup clearly is an idealist, and he's an idealist whose arguments for his position, to some extent, are based in very controversial interpretations of contemporary physics. So part of what happened in our discussion was that he tried to argue that quantum mechanics kind of requires some sort of idealism. And I think I find idealism to be quite bizarre, but then idealists often claim to find, I don't know what we'll call it, let's just call it realism, to be a bizarre position. And you can see this historically in discussions between Berkeley and his opponents. Berkeley professes just to be completely bewildered by whatever it could be that realists believe, and his opponents are completely bemused how anybody could be an idealist of the kind that Berkeley is.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, yeah, no, that I have nothing to say about that. Let's go to see if there's any more after this. Derek, he said, much better, my friend. Thank you for asking. Oh, yeah. Robert Herring, this is what I was looking for. I thought I missed this one, but it's right here. He says, faith, like love, is a choice. Yeah, interesting. You got anything to say about that?
So I'm wondering whether about there's two things here. One is that there's a kind of similarity between faith and love. And the other thing is that both of them rely on a choice. It's not clear. Maybe faith, it depends a bit what you mean by faith. If you're thinking of faith as belief, then it's not clear that it really makes sense to think that belief depends on choice. Right. I mean, it's quite clear that there's lots of things that you just can't choose to believe. Right. So the example I always use is you can't just choose to believe that there's a tiger in the room with you right now. I mean, you can try it and it might feel really weird, but you can't actually do it. Right. If you really believe that there was a kind of adult tiger in the room with you, you'd be getting out of there as quickly as possible, trying to avoid being eaten by it, right, or mauled by it or something, right? So it's not true that you can just believe at will.
I'm sorry.
There's more, but I'll let you jump.
No, well, I wanted to hear what you had to say, but what I was gonna say was, don't you feel like that faith and religion, like religions that are faith-based, like Islam, Christianity, the ones that you have to have faith in or else, not the Dharma ones where it's like whatever, regardless of that. But those type of religions, don't you think it's more of like an alignment of I align with this religion, because you can't force yourself to believe something that you can't see with your own eyes.
But you can believe stuff that you can't see, right? That happens all the time, right? And I don't want to say that that everybody who professes to have religious belief is kind of self-deceived and they don't really believe it, right? That's a kind of line that George Ray, and in some sense, they don't really believe it at all. I'm much more inclined to take what people say at face value. There are lots of people who really do believe, and their reasons for believing are quite diverse. But what isn't true is that they just chose it, right? That one day they said, okay, now I'm just going to believe this thing for no reason, right? I'm just going to believe it because I want to. I just don't think that belief works that way. And I don't think that love really works that way either, right? It's not really that there's a kind of question of choice about whether you love your children or not, or about whether if you've got kids, or whether you love your parents, if you've got parents, and so on. And so maybe there is a kind of analogy here with faith, but it works in the opposite direction. Neither of them is really something that you just choose.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. What I'm getting at, I guess, would be like with people who they believe in a religion because, for example, if I believe this, I'll go to heaven, and if I don't, I might go to hell. I almost wonder if it's a lot of it is based on sort of not being manipulated, but sort of like more of a hope than actual belief, hoping that it's true. But they might not necessarily. They might deep down think this might not be. This doesn't look right. I don't really know if it's true, but I hope it is true, so I'm going to go with it. Does that make sense?
So, yeah, but then again, having that hope might not be best characterized as just making a choice either. And I can't now remember whether I said this at the beginning, but the sorting out how hope, faith, hope, faith, and belief are related to one another is quite complicated. And there's new stuff coming out in the journals at the moment, people trying to make clear what the connections between these things are. It's not a straightforward matter.
That's a good point. I was talking to Justin Sledge of Esoterica, another philosopher, who thinks that the word pistis in Greek should be translated as trust, because you're trusting in something that you don't necessarily have the evidence for, but you're saying, I trust this is going to be true, and that this God's going to protect me, or whatever the case is. I don't know. What do you think about that?
Yeah. So when you trust people, it's not something that you do by just a mere choice either, right? You have lots of evidence about the trustworthiness of people, and you keep reassessing for people, some people, whether you think you can trust them or not. And there are lots of people where you've kind of settled on, they're just trustworthy. And so you don't, it's not like you're suspicious of people all the time. Lots of people you've just settled into a state of trust because you know them well. But people, when you're getting to know them, or people where you suspect that they may have betrayed you in one way or another, their evidence is really important, right? And it's not just I'm just choosing to trust you, and the evidence is not playing any role.
Yeah, that makes sense. The next one is from Imposter Sir Spence. Thank you for the super chat. What is the ubermensch by Nietzsche, and did this not lead to the Nazi movement?
Okay, so this question could be inspired by that bus that's sitting behind me.
Nice. Yeah.
Which I'm the custodian of, for reasons which are probably don't deserve further examination.
Where'd you get it from?
Okay, so I will explain it. So
okay.
for many years, I was the CEO of the Australasian Association of Philosophy. There's a sculptor in Brisbane who did a series on philosophers. And when he died, his family, I think on his instruction, wanted to gift one of his sculptures to the association, and they did. And so someone in the association had to become the person who was the custodian of it. And so it ended up with me. So I'm the custodian of the AOP Nietzsche bust. It actually doesn't look too bad from this angle and small, but it's actually kind of hideous when you stand in front of it. It's really not good. But anyway, that's the story. Okay, so question: Did Nietzsche have some causal responsibility for the Nazis? That's pretty hard to say. Probably none, I would guess. The notion of the ubermensch might be twisted by some people to make it to connect it to fascism, but that's certainly not. I mean, Nietzsche's notion of the ubermensch was not political. It wasn't. He wasn't thinking about the governance of society. He was thinking about certain kinds of ways of living in the face of the various difficulties that confronted people in the middle of the 19th century, in the latter part of the 19th century. So I think the answer to the second question is no. The answer to the first question, so the ubermensch was a sort of ideal for Nietzsche of a way that a person could live. That will be.
So do you think that Nietzsche's ubermensch was sort of a elitist mentality, that we should have an elite group of people that are just like lead the way for mankind, and we should put all our focus on that? Or no? I've heard someone say that before.
No, I don't think so. I don't think. There's a certain sense in which it's elitist, but it's not political. He's not thinking about the plural. He's thinking about a single person and what's a kind of ideal for them. Right?
Interesting.
Whereas the fascists, it's definitely a political organization. It's on a large scale where there's going to be, rulers and people who are just dominated.
Do you think that he actually believed that this is a possible attainable thing, or do you think he was just being abstract in that and his ubermensch?
I don't think he was just being abstract. I mean, I think he thought that there would be people who attained the ideal.
Sure. It's fascinating. Thank you for that. Flamio says, thank you for the super chat. Are people who believe in fictional deities, as described by Fictional Theism 2015, Roy Sorensen, Theists?
So this is a good question. So you might think that you could be religious while still holding that the teachings of the religion are just fictions. Right? So there's another discussion that's going along quite strongly at the moment in philosophy about religious fictionalism. I think if you were a religious fictionalist, then you wouldn't count as a theist, right? Because you're thinking that it's just a fiction, that there are gods. It's just like if I think that the Sherlock Holmes stories are fictions, as I should, then I'm not going to think that Sherlock Holmes really existed. Right?
Yeah.
So I think that the answer to the question is going to be, well, no, they won't be theists, but they might nonetheless be religious believers, right? They may nonetheless be living out their lives as religious people. It's just that they think that there's, instead of there being some truths at the center of the religion, there's this fiction that it's important to base your life around.
Interesting. Thank you for that super chat. Michael Apple, thank you for the super chat. In what way is the cosmos as a necessary fact different than God as a necessary fact? Do we just call one brute and not the other? It's interesting.
No, they're both brute, right? I mean, my view, which is slightly controversial, is that necessities are brute. I mean, there's no explaining why necessary things are necessary. And you can explain why they're so. They're so because they have to be, right? That's what necessary means. But why do they have to be? At that point, explanation just comes to an end. In your theorizing, you don't want to have lots of necessities, right? But you're going to have some. And as I see it, there's no difference between, in this respect, right, between taking the cosmos as being the necessary fact and taking God as the necessary fact. In both cases, you've just got a necessity there, which is a theoretical cost.
Interesting. Thank you for that. Oh, Jesus Saves. Thank you for the super chat. What happened before the Big Bang? The Father.
So, okay.
This same person asked me the same question as someone else that I just had on.
Yeah.
So go ahead.
So suppose that causal reality is just our universe. So we live in a Big Bang universe. It begins with the initial singularity, right? And then you get massive expansion. We have the universe as we know it. There's nothing before the Big Bang, according to naturalists. Rather, the initial singularity is necessary. It just had to be. So that's where explanation runs out. What I just said depended on the assumption that our universe exhausts causal reality. That might not be true. There might be a multiverse. That multiverse might have an infinite history back into the past. There might be no beginning. Then there will certainly, but then there'll be lots of stuff that's before our universe, right? All this stuff that's happening out there in the multiverse. But we don't have any access to it. It's not clear that there is a multiverse.
Right.
Physicists, quite apart from arguments about God, physicists are just divided on the question whether there's a multiverse or not at the moment.
I've heard this from a couple of different physicists, and I tend to think this makes the most sense, and I want to hear your thoughts on, is that the universe actually is eternal. It's just that the matter from the Big Bang is what we see and what we experience. That had a beginning. Does that make sense?
So
that kind of butchered that.
So if the kind of standard version of the Big Bang theory were correct, space, time, and matter would all begin with the initial singularity. There are physicists, though they're still, I think, in a minority, who deny that there was a Big Bang, right? So the way to get an eternal universe is somehow or other to get away from the Big Bang, or to locate it in something much bigger like a multiverse, something like that.
Interesting. Thank you for that answer. Thank you for the super chat. I know there's a couple more. I just saw them. I'm trying to find them. Let's see. Ted Francis, thank you for the super chat. How do we solve the problem of evil?
Okay, so so what's called the problem of evil is a set of questions for theists who think that God's omnipotent, omniscient, perfectly good. So if you don't think that there's a God, or you don't think that God's omnipotent, or you don't think God's omniscient, or you don't think God's perfectly good, then problem's not going to arise. If you are a theist and someone says that there's this inconsistency in your beliefs because you think God's omnipotent, God's omniscient, God's perfectly good, and yet there's evil, the first thing that you should do as a theist is say, okay, spell out the argument for me, because those four claims on their own are not logically inconsistent. And so what you do is you give them some extra claims. Maybe there are no limits to what an omnipotent being can do, and a good thing eliminates evil as far as it can. Put those together with the claims I already had, and there is indeed a logical inconsistency. Problem is, now, for much easier though for the theist to answer, they can just deny that there are no limits on what an omnipotent being can do. They can say, look, there are logical limits. God can't make 2 and 2 equal 5. He can't make it the case that there's overcoming of evil unless there's evil, and overcoming of evil is one of the things that you would want to have in a decent world. Or and alternatively, you might go to the look, a good thing eliminates evil as far as it can. You might think that's not right either. What a good thing does is seek some balance between promoting good and eliminating evil. And it might be that the best thing to do in some cases is not to eliminate all the evil, to allow there to be certain kinds of goods, like overcoming evil, for example. Now, not saying any of that's kind of plausible, and it's certainly not the end of the story, but that's the way that I think theists properly respond to arguments from evil, right? Is they look at the claims that are supposed to be logically inconsistent, and they point out that actually they don't accept some of them.
Yeah, and a lot of times what you'll get in most religions is some explanation on why there's evil. Usually, like for example, Adam and Eve took a bite of the apple, and now that's why there's sin and evil. That's why there's death. It's just like all of it gets explained away in this one little tiny area.
So there's lots and lots of suffering in the world. Right. If you want an explanation of why there's suffering, then something that many theists and naturalists will agree is that in order for there to be suffering, there has to be sentience, and there's an evolutionary story that tells you how you get from a universe in which there was no sentience to one in which there's sentience. I mean, it's a long evolutionary history, but gradually you get the development of creatures with spinal cords and brains and nervous systems. And at that point, or somewhere not too much further down the track from there, you've got suffering, and arguably any suffering is an evil, right? So that's a kind of different way of answering the question. That's neutral on further questions about whether you need to bring in God in order to explain evolution or not.
That's interesting. That is the last one, I believe. So let's get back into what we were talking about in the beginning, I guess, with the atheism. So where do you see in your own personal philosophy, your own personal, from your own studies and research and your education, what do you think is I don't know how to phrase this. Like, what do you think is the sort of what do you think is the way forward as far as like a philosophical worldview? Like, do you think there should be what do you think about that?
So I doubt that the problems of philosophy will be resolved. I don't think that we're going to reach philosophical agreement, but I also suspect that even if there was kind of a way that you could engineer agreement amongst philosophers, like you kill all of them except the ones that hold a particular view, it would be completely unstable, right? And you would, within a few generations, you'd go back to a wide diversity of opinions. And I guess there's a kind of question you can ask here about why philosophy is like that. And it just seems to be, I mean, if you think about human knowledge more broadly, there are lots of areas where there's expert agreement on a whole lot of issues. So, for example, in physics, if you've got a problem that falls in the domain of classical mechanics, at least in principle, physicists can tell you how to solve that problem already. We just know a whole lot of stuff about that domain. And the same is true in chemistry, biology, medicine, all over the place, right? There's expert consensus about lots of stuff. And where there is an expert consensus, there's generally expert consensus about the methods, at least, that you would use to solve the problems, right? So there's lots of kind of current research where we don't know answers to questions yet, but we think that the research that we're doing will, in a relatively short period of time, years, decades, bring us the answers. Philosophy is not like that at all. Philosophy, right? all there seems to be is disagreement. There's no convergence over time. And it is true that things that were philosophical cease to be philosophical. So once there was natural philosophy and now we've got science, right? And when we just had natural philosophy, it was speculative and all over the place. So, I mean, philosophy does make progress by disappearing, but there's stuff that's been, some of the questions that we've got are the same questions, to go back to something at the beginning, that Aristotle and Plato were arguing about. We're still arguing about them, and we have many more positions, and they're much more refined, but we're no closer to reaching consensus.
Right.
And my hunch, which you might think is a bit pessimistic, is that things are just going to stay that way as long as there are people doing philosophy. There'll just be all these areas where we can't manage to find expert agreement. And at the moment, I don't know what to say about why that is. It seems to be, but in a way, I think that it's just that's the nature of philosophy. What philosophy is just the study of these questions that we can't figure out how to get expert agreement on the answers, or even the methods that we should use to try to answer them.
Do you think that the Epicureans and the atomists are the ones who sort of led to natural philosophy, which led to science?
I don't know. Aristotle was fairly impressive as a kind of proto-scientist. So I think that there's no reason to think that he was any less of a scientist than and he may well have been more of a scientist. I mean, I don't know. And it's kind of hard to judge because we have so little of the works of so many of the people from antiquity that we don't know the full range of their interests. But there wasn't really a distinction between philosophy and sciences until well into modernity. Right? So, you might think that the atomists just lucked out, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that was one of the kind of a priori possible views. They had it, but they didn't have particularly good reasons for endorsing the position that they did. It just turned out to be, at least at a kind of certain level of approximation, it turned out to be about right.
I've been wondering that for so long. When I first found out about the atomists being people before the time of Jesus, going back in like 4th century BC, were theorizing that the universe is made up of atoms and void. I was like, wait, what? That was before? We're going back that far? I was like, wait a minute, how do they know that? And like you said, they might have just got lucked out. Like they were.
They didn't. I don't think they knew, but it didn't kind of map out a line of inquiry. Right. Eventually, that turned out to be quite fruitful.
Wow. Yeah.
Chemistry and particle physics and so on.
Yeah, it's very fascinating that they came up with those theories that early on. I got another super chat. Micah Volland, thank you for the super chat. What do you think about Dharma religions? What about Taoism?
Okay, so if the Dharma religions include Hinduism and Buddhism, so let's start there. A lot of Hindus get counted as theists, so it's, I mean, and regardless of whether they're theists, there's this commitment to, I don't know, samsara, karma, and so on, which naturalists are not going to accept. There's a kind of supernatural superstructure to reality that naturalists are not going to accept. It's also the case in both Hinduism and Buddhism that lots of people who belong to those religions believe in lots of entities that we might call gods, we might not, but in any case, they're kind of supernatural things that sit below the main god, if there is a main god. or in Buddhism, they're things that are kind of independent of the Buddha, but they're nonetheless kind of supernatural entities. And naturalists are not going to believe in them either. Of course, in both traditions, but especially in the Hindu tradition, there are lots of different philosophical schools, and there are schools of materialists, there are schools of atheists, along with other schools of idealists, all kinds of stripes. And so if we're thinking about this from a philosophical point of view, it gets very complicated very quickly. On the Taoist side, the history of Taoism also is one where at various times there's a huge amount of belief in supernatural stuff that goes along with Taoism. And then there are periods in the history where there's much less, and there are even people who turn up who it gets argued are kind of proto-naturalists or naturalists.
Interesting. Thank you for that. Robert Herring, good friend of the show. Thank you for the super chat. Is there an ultimate limit as to what humans can know?
So it's always going to be the case that what any individual person knows is a tiny, tiny fragment of what we know collectively. Just go and stand in a big library and look around the shelves in the non-fiction section at the millions and millions of books.
Right.
It's also the case that if you think about all the true propositions, that collectively we only ever know a tiny, tiny fragment of them. Right? And that's not going to change either. It's always going to be the case that what we know is a tiny amount that floats in a vast sea of ignorance. One question, though, will be about the kind of important stuff that's important to us. Are there, how much of that do we know? Now, and it's much harder to say something just straight off the cuff about that. And a different question is, are there particular things that we can't know? Well, obviously, we can't point to them, right? We can't say what they are. But it's I think, quite plausible in for various reasons that there will turn out to be things that some of us would like to have opinions about, that it's impossible for us to gain knowledge about. The philosophers have all kinds of conjectures here. There are some people, so Colin McGinn thought that the kind of nature of the connection between mind and body was something that would just never become intelligible to us, right? Just to give you an example. I'm not inclined to agree with him about that, but that's kind of useful as an example of the kind of thing that some philosophers would say in response to your question.
Interesting. Do you think there's a possibility that it's like I've heard like people say, there's a lot of theists say this, that we're like ants in a molehill, that we have no idea that there's a giant world that we're in. We can only focus on our little area, and we don't know what's beyond us.
So, I mean, that could be true. I mean, going back to what I said about multiverse, right?
Yeah.
If there is a multiverse, we're not going to have very direct access to it, that epistemic or doxastic access to it. But even if, but suppose that there's just a single universe. As time goes by, we learn a lot about its broad scale structure. I mean, if you compare what we know with what was known in the middle of the 18th century, right, is our knowledge about the extent and the contents of the universe has exploded in that time.
Right. Yeah, that's a good answer. And I think there's one more, actually. Yeah, one just popped up. I'm trying to find it. Here it is. Yakovi Isram. Thoughts on the simulation theory?
Okay, so I'm assuming, there's different things you can mean by simulation theory. One thing that you might mean is a hypothesis about in philosophy of mind about how we interpret other people, but I'm assuming that what you've got in mind is the idea that we're just part of a computer simulation,
Right.
kind of virtual reality plus hypothesis or something like that. Okay, so my take on this is that I suspect that it's kind of incoherent to think that we're part of a computer simulation, and there are lots of people who've tried to run an argument of this kind, and it's not exactly clear how to make the case so that it's really convincing. But that's my hunch. I think that we know what we know that we live in a kind of material world,
Right.
and there's something deeply incoherent in trying to suppose otherwise. That's what I suspect.
Yeah, there's no reason to believe that. I mean, like, what would be the reason for like having blood and organs and all this stuff that makes somebody coherent in conscience, having a brain and all this arteries, and why would you need all that if it's just like we're just a hologram, or just, you know what I mean? And I guess that could be, you would argue, well, that's part of the system, that's part of the program, but it's like, really?
Right. So the idea would be, as you just said, that it's all just part of the program. But I'll just since I don't quite know how to articulate the thought further, I'll just leave it as I don't think that that in the end that makes sense.
Right. Yeah, I agree. I think it's like, it would be, and if that was the case, then this is a really, really bad simulation. This is just poorly done. You know what I mean? Like, why would there be a simulation where a baby deer gets born in the wilderness and a predator comes and eats it right away? Like, what was the point of that part of the simulation? So it's like, you know what I mean? There's so much suffering and like so much nonsense happening in this universe, in this world, planets blowing up and colliding and all. What would be the point of all that if it was a simulation, right?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it depends on what attributes you're going to give to the people running, or the agents running the simulation, right? If they're like the people who design video games, then it's entirely predictable, I would have thought.
Yeah. So we got a couple minutes left. Just I think that was the last super chat. But since we're talking about these like sort of abstract ideas, what do you think about time travel? I asked this to Lawrence Cross, and he had some pretty interesting stuff to say. Like, do you think it's ever going to be possible? Like, I guess theoretically it is, but I don't know. What do you do? It's really, really hard.
So I don't know. My hunch is that it's not theoretically possible. That in the following sense, that the account of the kind of true account about the way the world is actually entails that it's impossible. But I could well be wrong about that. It's certainly the case that people made models, say in general relativity, where there's time travel, and those models seem to be consistent, coherent, whatever. It's certainly possible, as most people who've read David Lewis on time travel will admit, that you can tell a pretty coherent story about time travel. So it's so as to not give people the wrong idea. While my own view is that it's probably impossible, it's highly controversial, both amongst philosophers and amongst physicists.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm not an expert, but I guess if you travel at the speed of light far distances and came back, I think wouldn't time sped up in that instance?
Okay, so we're probably not going to count that as time travel.
Okay,
that's just travel.
Yeah, I guess you're right. Yeah. So in the past, going into the past would probably be almost impossible, as this commenter has just pointed out. My friend Critical Faculty says time travel isn't possible into the past due to entropy, possible into the future through wormholes. What do you think about that?
So I guess I don't know enough about the physics to know why you can't have. I mean, if you've got a wormhole between 2 points, it would seem to follow from that comment that you can only travel through it in one direction. Because if you could travel through it in both directions, then you could go, one of them would be going to the past, and from one direction be going past, and the other direction be going to the future. So, but I know nothing about the physics of wormholes.
Yeah, me neither. I don't know. I just wanted to ask you about this since we already had so many crazy comments and super chats. By the way, I really appreciate all of them. They were really thought provoking. But I just felt like since we're already in the realm of simulation theory and multiverse theory, I might as well just let's go with time travel. So, but yeah, is there anything you want to promote while you're here and you got some people watching? Any books coming out?
So I won't have a new book for a few years, I don't think. I've got a new project on the theory of argument and argumentation, which when it comes out, I imagine that it'll be a pretty heavy philosophical book. The last couple of books that I wrote were aimed for a more general audience, so I might as well promote my book, Atheism, the Basics, which I think is more readable than most things that I've written. And also the recent debate book with Kenny Pierce, Is There a God? It's a much bigger book than Atheism, the Basics, but it's closer to containing my current thoughts. I mean, like all philosophers, I kept changing my mind about lots of stuff, but those two books.
Yeah, and anyone that's interested, go to Amazon.com, just type in Graham Oppy, and there's tons of books up there, really good ones too. God and the Problem of Evil, arguing about gods, Atheism, the Basics, Is There a God, all that stuff, philosophical perspective on infinity, and as well as another paper called The Ontological Arguments. And so, yeah, there's a lot of stuff to read if you're interested, and go to Amazon. And do you have a website, by the way?
I have a university website, but there's nothing interesting on it.
Yeah, so go check them out on Amazon. And like I always say, you have just attained true gnosis.
You have just attained true gnosis. The demiurge has no power over you.